Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers, with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon. Today's episode is brought to you by Sal Drainado and the Brooklyn Plumbers Academy, training the next generation of plumbers since 1985.
And welcome back to episode 8 of A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy. I am your host, Ben Siders.
And this is Kirk Damon. Once again, Kirk Leggett is the captain of the Enterprise.
And today's topic is video games and video game clones. And shout out to Mary in St. Louis for the topic idea. Now, if you're listening to this, I'm going to guess you have probably at some point in your life played a video game, but you may not know what all goes into them. They actually encompass a lot of different kinds of intellectual property. And I'm sure you've noticed that there are clones, not Star Wars clones, but video game clones.
Yep. And that's the thing is that if we have some of our leaders some of our listeners very well may also be people who are actually programming video games
and maybe made clones themselves.
There are a lot of video games out there. There's a lot of very fun video games out there, and there's especially I think with the influx of mobile gaming and the ability to get stuff out to the public very quickly using iTunes Store, other sort of platforms along those lines, we are seeing just a huge influx of games people are designing, personally, privately, many of which are may have very fun gameplay, but very poor graphics, or vice versa. But we're seeing just huge numbers of video games that are coming out there. We also think we've seen a change in the video game attitude. I think video gaming has become something which went from a very niche, really sort of kids' toy to now becoming a universal entertainment form.
Yeah, the demographics have changed a lot. We're at the point where I think, if not more, than about half of all gamers are now female. I can tell you from personal experience, when I was a kid, that was not the case.
Yeah, and I think you also have the issue that a lot more games have become more adult. A lot of gamers have become more adult. You've also seen a change in games themselves, where if you look back, I think at a lot of games, the original sort of video arcades, video arcades were teenager hangouts. That was the thing in conjunction with
my mom wouldn't let me go into them.
Yeah, and there was a lot of, parents not letting, younger kids go into video game arcades. But we go back and we look at a lot of those games, and those games are, quite frankly, very tame compared to what, exists nowadays that you can, obtain via, a download platform or via kind of any kind of console.
So video game clones, and if you've ever developed a game, you've probably made a clone. This is how we usually start learning how to write games, is you make something that plays the same way as a game you like. But a video game clone is basically a new game that has the same basic gameplay and concept as another game, but some differences, maybe some minor variations in gameplay, and usually fresh art, fresh sound, new look, new feel. And a good example of that is the original Warcraft game. It effectively started, I'm going to say, it's probably not strictly true, but started the real-time strategy genre, or at least popularized it.
It definitely was one of the first ones, and it may very well be the first sort of that was the true real-time, where it's that, there were definitely strategy games out there.
They're usually turn-based, though.
Yeah, they were very turn-based.
And Panzer General and those kind of games.
Yep.
And then after that came Command & Conquer, which was also very successful, and then hundreds of other games that played the same basic way, but none of them were nearly as good.
And I think that's one of the things we really talk about is it's a lot of times when we're talking about clones, what we really are talking about in many respects is similar genres. So, real-time strategy, RTS, is an acknowledged genre. First-person shooters, an acknowledged genre. But there's always some first game that came out with whatever that, genre becomes.
Well, the cloning phenomenon got so bad, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, especially with Blizzard's Diablo, that a new internet phrase was coined, YADC, Y-A-D-C, yet another Diablo clone.
Yep.
And I remember seeing reviews where they would describe a game as yet another Diablo clone. It was just a matter of how good of a clone was it.
Yeah, and that's the thing I think you bump into is it literally was. How good of the clone was it? Did it have good gameplay? I think one of the things you really bump into in conjunction with cloning as well is to keep in mind these are not the same games necessarily. They have similar gameplay usually. The mechanics are similar, but oftentimes they may have some other elements. They may change something. And the interesting thing about that you bump into with it is that those changes may actually make a better game. One of the ones I pick on, and actually one of my favorite games, mobile games that I used to play for a long time, was a game called Crush the Castle, which nobody's ever heard of. Crush the Castle was firing a trebuchet that fired various different kinds of ammunition
I remember
to
that
try
one.
to knock down a castle and kill the various knights that are in it. A few years later, a game called Angry Birds came out that uses a very similar style of gameplay. But it's one of those where I always loved Crash the Castle because trying to fire the trebuchet involved a lot of, real game mechanics. But it was, it's much simpler than a slingshot is. But that's a good example of sort of where you can see an earlier potential one not being the one everybody knows, the one everybody knows being a later version.
So cloning obviously happens, and it's apparently legal because people keep doing it and not getting in trouble for it. The question we're going to discuss is why. Is there no IP that can cover this? And if not, why not? And should there be? So let's start by talking about types of IP in video games. Probably the simplest and I'd argue the most important would be source code, compiled executables, libraries, all the programming and software aspects of it.
Yep, and that pretty much we're all talking copyright.
Yeah,
all
copyright.
Get into those things.
But the part you see the most as a player is the asset files, the way that the objects in the game look, the art files, the sound files, animations, 3D models, stuff like that.
Yep. Yeah, and that's, there's no question this stuff is sort of all covered by copyright as to whatever it is. Where you talk about sort of gameplay, and I think a lot of the gameplay is not so much the art files or anything along those lines. Most clones are not going to use the art files. Yeah. They're not going to use similar looks. Many of them change the looks dramatically. So a lot of that they're clearly getting away from copyright. What the copyright potentially being used is the engine, which is really the source code. Getting into it.
But if you write your own engine or you just you license it, say, so you're allowed to use it,
yep.
The gameplay itself is not really something that we can copyright, is it?
Yeah, well, and again, I think that's what you get into. Now, there is the idea that you can license, that people are licensing the engines. There is the possibility there of there being some copyright protection to the engine outside of the specific core source code, but you almost have the free market kind of dealing with the legal question here of whether or not there is protection to the gameplay by simply saying there's unquestionably the protection to the source code. What we'll do is license you the source code, which saves you a vast amount of work as a game designer, and so therefore it's worthwhile to everybody. As we sort of talked about in the last episode and the idea of contracts, there's clearly consideration here in both sides because you've saved the game designer an enormous amount of work. The person who originally developed the game engine has made, a license fee in conjunction with this, so we have an enforceable contract at that point in time. And at that point in time, copyright becomes superfluous because it's licensed.
And then we're kind of back to the idea-expression dichotomy where the particular engine is one expression of that set of game rules or gameplay, but nothing about the copyright in that one expression would prevent you, if you didn't want to pay the licensing fee, from just writing your own.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where you get into the interesting question of a lot of it at this point in time is that question never gets asked because, people are not necessarily developing their own game engines. To the extent they are developing their own game engines to do something similar, the code is so different.
Yeah.
I mean, they are very much developing their own thing. A lot of times it may be
in a different language
platform.
entirely,
Yep.
And
a lot of times it's a different platform. And a lot of times if you're going to do that, it's because you want to make major changes to the way the engine works.
What about, say, literary elements to games? Modern games usually have some sort of story. There's dialogue, scripts, text, tutorial text maybe. Those are probably all copyrightable.
Oh, again, all copyrightable. I mean, and this is one of those things where, again, we sort of talk about the evolution of video games. Modern video games are almost more akin to movies.
They really
in many respects. There's video games.
The game market's bigger than the movie market now.
Yeah, and I comment about it. I said, it's when you see like previews for like TV ads and stuff like that in conjunction with video games. A lot of times what they're showing you is cinema graphics in the middle.
Yeah,
they're not showing you the actual gameplay elements. They even put the disclaimers on. This is not gameplay elements, just to let you know that that's the nature of it. And I think in many respects, a lot of people that care very deeply about those. There's a lot of characters. I comment about it as it's still one of the most memorable things I think I ever had in a video game playing experience is playing StarCraft 2. And when you suddenly have Kerrigan become a Zerg.
Oh, yeah.
And it's, you're sitting here like, oh my goodness, what just happened? That's a cinematic.
Yeah, or I'm thinking Wing Commander. Wing Commander 3, the one that had Mark Hamill in it. Okay. There's a spoiler alert. If you haven't played it, go play it. If you can find a machine.
It's a good game. Yeah, if you can find a machine that'll play it.
But there's near the end, the Kilrathi, is that what they were called? Hobbs was the Kilrathi pilot that played for the good guys, and he betrays everybody and kills one of the pilots and goes back to the Kilrathi. And I remember playing that. I was so mad. I wanted to go back and replay the whole thing and never pick Hobbs as my wingman. I was so irritated that happened.
Well, and that's interesting enough. You sort of talk about that kind of a plot and similar as the plot. That sounds a little bit like Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, it kind of does.
You're sort of talking about that, and again, that's where we sort of talked about previously. We've mentioned stuff in copyright. This idea, expression dichotomy. The idea of somebody being, a traitor and betraying their forces. That's not exactly new. I mean, let's go back to Benedict Arnold.
Yeah.
So, that's not a unique, game mechanic in any respects as to what it is, so you can't necessarily protect it.
Let's define game mechanics. What we're really talking about with game mechanics is gameplay, the set of rules that define how the various game elements interact and how the user interacts with them, and basically how you win, how you play, how you accomplish things. It's what I think makes games fun. I don't care how good the graphics are. If the mechanics aren't fun, I don't care.
Yeah, and I think most people do care a lot about game mechanics. It's the fundamental thing people like. You've got to have good graphics. You've got to have a game that's entertaining enough. But again, I think particularly with sort of the switch we've seen now in modern gaming, we've gone back to platforms that aren't quite as powerful. When we're talking about playing on tablets and stuff like that, although they're getting there. One of the things you really see is that how well does this game play? Do I enjoy it? And I think a lot of times when players get upset with games, they tend to get upset because mechanics have changed.
Yeah, and they perceive that it's unfair, or it's unfair in somebody else's favor, usually.
It's unfair in somebody else's favor, or in some sense, and quite frankly, and this is one I know we've talked about in conjunction with certain games, it just gets too complicated.
Yeah, to the point where you spend more time micromanaging all the data and all the aspects of the game and not actually just playing it and having fun.
Yeah, now there are obviously games that people play because of that, that they enjoy doing it.
Civilization. I love Civilization for that exact reason.
Yeah, and it's, the sort of micromanaging the components of it, but it's do you enjoy a video game that you kind of have to have a notebook of stuff on the side? I joke about it because, we've done a lot with Minecraft, both of us in conjunction with, and I have a large notebook of where things are, which, sort of look at it and it's like, wait a minute, why do I have this huge paper backup for a video game? Why isn't this something I'm just playing the video game?
That's why I quit playing World of Warcraft before law school. At some point, I spent like 4 hours trying to get a raid put together, and I'm like, this just became a second job I don't get paid to do.
Yeah, and actually the raid concept is actually a really good one to, I think, talk about, which is there's a lot of things coming into games right now when you're talking about game mechanics, which effectively require gameplay outside of the video game, the raid being the perfect example. It's something where if you want to go and you want to carry these things out, you need 50 players.
And you have to coordinate them somehow.
Yeah, you have to coordinate them, you have to get them together. You really can't do it in-game. It's not, in a lot of games, it's physically impossible. You just need everybody to show up at the same location at the same time.
That alone's a logistical cat-herding exercise. Well, so game mechanics, as we alluded to, are usually not, I would say usually, almost never copyrightable, because they're basically sets of rules, and the Copyright Act specifically says somewhere that you can't copyright instructions and rules and things like that. Why is that?
I think because a lot of the reason that they say you can't do it is because it basically doesn't show a lot of expression. It's a specific thing. If here's just a way to carry something out. And I think a good way to look at it is a recipe.
Yeah, also not copyrightable.
Also not copyrightable. When you look at what a recipe is, it just says, here's how to make a cake. There's no expression in here to make a cake. It's all scientific. And particularly when you're talking baking, it is very scientific.
I think there's a public policy argument, too, that basic elements of human society, like teaching people how to do things. I mean, with fair use, education is always one of the strongest arguments for a fair use. We're teaching people, we're making people into competent adults who can get by in the world. And I think as a matter of public policy, we just don't want anybody to kind of lock up those basic tools of educating a society.
Yeah, I think that's very true as to, what you might get into it. And again, you sort of get the idea as it lacks expression, it's got basic tools. You can kind of quickly see that these are things we really shouldn't be saying other people can't use. I mean, if we're going to give you the instructions for building, like
copywriting a yardstick. Like, what's there to copyright?
Yeah, and that's, you could potentially copyright the specific expression of a yardstick, but can you really copyright the concept of a yard?
No.
I don't know if you guys have ever seen the meter, which is, of course, in a French museum, the official stick, which is exactly 1 meter.
Well, this creates real problems for video game design, not just video game, any game designer. So I've actually got on the shelf in my law office, I have the Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition books. And if you ever looked
This is just how much of a geek he is. Instead of his law books, he has Dungeons & Dragons reference guides.
Yeah, my law books are in a box somewhere. But if you've looked through an RPG instruction manual, you'll notice that it is full of charts, tables, numbers, graphs. 2nd edition was famous for the THACO table. None of that stuff is usually copyrightable because there's nothing really expressive about it. It's just a bunch of numbers.
Yep.
But that's why I think that Wizards of the Coast, or before that TSR, puts in all the fluff material. They put in background stories, or they kind of tell the story of making a new character. You got to have something copyrightable in those books, because just the raw data and rules by themselves probably isn't.
A lot of it, I think you also get into, quite frankly, with the fluff and the need for fluff. And interestingly enough, I mean, we all do refer to it as fluff. I mean, that's the common assertion as to
tacit acknowledgement of what it is.
Yeah, you also bump into the idea of I can give you a great game, but if there's no story behind it, why am I playing it? If you want a great game with no fluff, go play chess.
Yeah. Well, and I think another reason why this kind of stuff is not copyrightable is that we have a whole different set of IP that's meant to cover what's basically functional aspects of these things, and that would be patents.
Yep. And that is, we talked about, again, sort of idea-expression dichotomy. And when we start getting into idea, we can look at the idea and say there isn't enough expression here. We can look at the idea of say that the rules of a game is an idea. The methodology for playing is a unique idea. I mean, at some point in time, somebody developed the rules for poker. Using a deck of cards, and those kind of games. And I'm going to focus for a second on it. Let's take card games or dice games. Really basic games that require gambling apparatus, which have been around for centuries. I mean, the card deck has been around for huge periods of time. The concept of dice have been around for a huge period of time. Random elements, random generation. Again, usually associated with true gambling. Mm-hmm. But you sort of look at it and say, how many different ways are there to use these things? They're very simple aspects. You can have dice be everything from, how you're rolling the distance you travel, on a board game to Yahtzee, which is entirely based upon how you roll a dice, almost a pure random, and then a sort of selection of dealing with mathematical probabilities coming out of it.
Well, and the problem with falling back on patents to protect any of this stuff is, well, up until a couple years ago, there wasn't any big problem other than you had to have something really interesting and different and novel in your game. But now we have this Supreme Court case from a couple years ago that has narrowed down what you can get patent protection for in software. And they've basically said if all you're doing is taking an abstract idea from one place, like a board game or a video game, and implementing it in software, that by itself is usually not enough to even qualify for patent protection, regardless of how interesting or novel it is.
Now, interestingly, they don't say that you can't patent a game initially, coming up with a concept initially, an entirely new concept. But actually, one of the key, I think, Section 101 or Alice cases associated with this has to do with a computer playing bingo.
Yeah. And they said no patent.
Yeah, they said no patent because, essentially the rules for bingo are well known. All you're doing is implementing them on a computer.
Yeah, and that's not enough to qualify for patent protection. Basically, if the computer is just doing the things that computers do and nothing more interesting than that, then they're not going to let you have a patent on it because it threatens to, that nobody else can do bingo on a computer. And I think this boils down again to a public policy consideration. The court just didn't want that to happen.
Yeah, you're always going to get into those kind of, issues of the public policy and courts sort of looking at it and sort of applying the law to reach a result they want to. I mean, that's something that when you become a lawyer, you start to realize happens without any question, that the law is bent to meet a requirement that the court thinks is necessary. And I think there is some argument of saying we didn't want people to be able to just computerize playing any game because we want to be able to say that that's not something which should be patentable.
Now, that said, you and I have gotten a couple of game patents issued, but they were unique. It wasn't on the gameplay itself so much as other aspects of the technology pertaining to the game. So a good example of that would be if you come up with, a cool innovation to, handle server load balancing for an RPG or something. That's not game mechanics. It is a patent that would cover an aspect of your game, but it's more of an improvement to how the computer works as opposed to the game itself.
And I think that's the important thing to keep in mind in here. When we're talking about game mechanics may not be truly patentable, but a lot of times the implementation of game mechanics requires something else. Server load balancing being a good example. How do you deal with, the fact that you've got characters coming in and out very, very quickly?
Or VR helmet.
VR helmet. How do you do matchmaking? Those are kind of the things you get into in conjunction with like random games where you've got players that are playing each other at a sort of random matchmaking type of things. Those kind of things all pretty much are patentable. You also get into the hardware aspects of it. I always comment about it, as I said, a good example is the old Mousetrap game.
Oh, yeah.
That's a game which is very, very structurally dependent on the Mousetrap. And one can argue that the Mousetrap itself is potentially patentable. Particularly, and I think this is the thing to think about with video games right now. We're moving into the AR, VR world here in conjunction with video games. There's a lot of potential mechanical structures, a lot of potential hardware that needs to go into place to make those games work. And there's a lot of software that needs to make the interaction with the hardware work. So now you have the possibility of, is that kind of stuff patentable? And I think that's where you're starting to get into the question of probably, actually.
And the other problem we have with patents is more of a practical problem. We're moving away, I think we're generally moving away from the era of gigantic, gigantic production games that people play for years and years on end, and more towards short sessions, quick play games. I mean, those two industries kind of both exist, but the mobile games in particular, your shelf life for a mobile game, setting aside Hearthstone, which is more of a card game implemented on a computer. But your typical mobile game, doesn't have that long of a shelf life. By the time you even get a patent application filed, much less actually issued, your game's probably commercially irrelevant.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the other thing you see a lot of with patenting, and part of the reason I think you don't see a lot of IP protection in this is because a lot of these games do have a relatively short
it's just not worth it.
lives. Yeah,
and patents are expensive. So patents don't help much. Copyright doesn't help much. So is it just a free-for-all out there? And I think the answer is not quite.
Yeah, not quite. And the biggest things I think you get into is you've still got effects from patent, copyright, and also trademark in conjunction with these things. And a lot of it gets into, are you cloning or are you copying? And it sounds weird because, what is a clone versus what is a copy? I'm going to jump to, episode 2, as much as I may not necessarily like to refer to the prequels. No. But we look at the idea and say that the clones made of Jango Fett are not copies of Jango Fett. They specifically go into, it's effectively his children. Now, they're his clones, but they are not truly copies of him. I mean, they go through the process of it. They have to be raised. They have accelerated growth. They're all taught. He's used as a basic, sort of, core of what's going to become these clones, a template. But they're not copies of him. Again, a template's maybe a good word to look at it. They're really not copying him. They're using him as the basic. So you can kind of look at it and say what they're copying in conjunction with this or what they're cloning. Basic game mechanics. He has, certain skill sets. He has certain abilities in order to learn, stuff like that. That's how he's chosen. But at the same time, they're not copying him. They're making clone troopers, which are designed for a different purpose. One of which is those have to follow orders. And as we well know, Jango Fett does not do a very good job of following orders.
Yeah, he was an odd choice just narratively for that particular role in the film.
Well, yeah.
Well, so looking at a couple of actual cases, I think one of the earliest cases on this involve Pac-Man, and we were talking on the way over here. K.C. Munchkin.
Yep, K.C. Munchkin.
Which was basically, gameplay-wise, actually differed significantly from Pac-Man in some ways, but the main character was, they called a gobbler, like Pac-Man, just a giant head with a mouth, and then the pursuit characters were ghosts, and in that case, the district court originally said no infringement because there's nothing copyrightable in Pac-Man, but the Seventh Circuit disagreed and reversed it, basically saying the concept of the chase maze game where you've got a central character being chased by pursuit characters, that's just the idea. There's a lot of ways to express that, but K.C. Munchkin chose to express it in basically the exact same way that Atari did.
Yeah, and that's what, if I remember the case specifically, they have ghosts in conjunction with it.
Yeah, similar types of animations, that kind of thing.
Similar animation, things along those lines.
I want to read one line from this that those of you who are video game fans may take offense to. This was, and bear in mind, this is 1982, but the court says, video games, unlike an artist's painting, appeal to an audience that is fairly undiscriminating insofar as they're concerned about subtle differences in artistic expression. That might have been true in 1982. I think it's not so much true now.
It's a great quote. Again, we talked a little bit about the idea of video games changing. I think one has to question, especially in today's day and age, how much a clone with terrible art, terrible storyline would really be able to, with identical gameplay, would really be able to hold its own against a game like Halo.
Yeah, if it's bad, it's got to be good bad. Like, it has to be bad on purpose.
Yeah.
Like bad B movies. So that case came out in favor of Atari, and they enjoined K.C. Munchkin, and they actually cite to that case other examples of maze chase games that were different enough to not be a problem. Another interesting one, Asteroid versus Meteor. Now, Meteor's just scientifically wrong, but set that aside. They said no infringement. The idea is ship flying through asteroids, and that the whole thing is sans affaire, which we covered last year. Yeah. It's a rudimentary sci-fi concept. Now, I can't help but think that the motivation for this ruling is that Empire Strikes Back had just come out at the time, and so the concept of ship flying through asteroids was sort of, that's been done.
Yes, and it is. You sort of get into the idea of a sans affair, what do you have with this? It's a basic concept. You're trying to avoid hitting something. Yeah. I mean, we have ships flying through asteroid games today. I mean, we'll plug a local company here in conjunction with it, with their Roid Rage.
Oh yeah, Butterscotch
Shenanigans, which if you have not played it, that game will drive you berserk.
It's a blast. I just played it again yesterday. Remember, I'm just sitting around, I got like 5 minutes to burn, that's what I load up to play.
Yeah, and that game will literally drive you berserk. It's an incredibly fun.
Those guys are so good at making games that are infuriatingly hard, but you can't put them down. Okay, so what can you really do to set your game apart? I'm sort of an amateur game designer. And I always think about what makes the game fun for me and what are the unique narrative elements because the narrative elements are going to be copyrightable. So whatever that is, if those are the unique aspects, world building exercises basically. How do you weave this universe within the game that makes it fun and interesting to play?
What's interesting is what we're sort of commenting about is you as a video game designer, what we're now saying actually becomes the protectable aspects and the valuable aspects of your video game is you being an author.
Yeah.
Not so much the fact that you're a good game designer, that you're a good coder, but that you're a good writer, which is kind of interesting. You think about it, I think a lot of the large game companies obviously know this. I mean, they have, they hire people solely to write background, solely to write storylines.
Blizzard's a great example of that. Their games all have that sort of irreverent, goofy fun factor. That's not what everybody wants. Sometimes you want like a serious, dark game. But if you just want to play casually, something fun and lighthearted, I mean, they just did the new expansion, the Lich King one for Hearthstone, which they took the concept of turning to evil and everybody dying and made it fun and goofy.
Yeah, and it's very silly. It's also completely breaking the fourth wall, and the fact that when you play a lot of these things, the Lich King is actually referring to the fact that this is a card game that he's in.
Yeah, and Blizzard doesn't always make the best design games as far as, a flawless mathematical implementation of a concept.
There's lots of arguments that the Hearthstone is not particularly balanced. I mean, certain decks can become more powerful at certain times.
But the games are well put together, and they're just plain fun. And I'd rather pay $50 for a pack of Hearthstone cards and have fun playing it than a boring, lifeless game that's free, even if the mechanics are gorgeously implemented and flawless.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the sort of big things you get into with it is how much of it is, the storyline and stuff like that. And I just want to tie that back into, we talked about the question we got at the end of the last episode, and sort of, now that like a patent on tapping a card, imagine the other, why do we not expect to see just huge numbers of clones come out? And I think the answer is there's already large numbers of card games out there, both video implemented. I mean, Magic can now be played, digitally.
But Magic still owns the copyrights to all of their cards. You can't just make a copy of a Magic pack. And,
exactly. But I think the thing you get into with it is that, mechanically, even to the extent the mechanics were patented, that's out there. But what you really see is how well are they implemented. A lot of those utilize existing properties. I mean, again, Overpower being a good example, which was set in the Marvel universe, then the DC universe, utilized a storyline from elsewhere. Many of these games were originally based upon role-playing games that had very well-established universes, whether it's Dungeons & Dragons or whether it's something else that's out there.
Well, Hearthstone's kind of a Magic clone, and then Bethesda did a Skyrim implementation of the same basic concept, which I've played, and I love Skyrim. It's a fun game, but it's still it's not as fun to me as Hearthstone, and I couldn't tell you why, other than Blizzard just has that knack for doing that.
And that's a lot of the things with it is I think the outcome of what we see is we're not going to see something rampant because we already see clowns. As soon as a genre becomes a genre and people are interested in playing games
Everybody
of that
wants
genre.
Farmville. How many Farmville clones were there?
Yeah, which really is a sort of off of Mafia Wars. We want to go back in Zynga, and Mafia Wars was based on a prior version of theirs too. I can't even remember which one that one was. But a lot of those kind of games, they become popular. People enjoy that general genre. It becomes a genre just because one person's going to lose their IP, have a patent expire, have whatever it is, even if they were the first implementer. I don't think that's going to dramatically change the number that comes into it. Yes, you may have people who now use that game mechanic specifically because it makes something easier to implement, whatever it might be.
Think about Magic. Is Magic successful because you tap a card by turning it sideways?
Yeah, I mean, it's successful because of the fact that it has a great storyline. It's got, just fantastic artwork.
And compelling gameplay.
Yeah, and good gameplay and
I
stuff.
was never good at it. We're once again running over. We should just change the timing on these and say we're going to go half an hour every time because we keep doing that. We actually have no questions for this week, so we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you again to Mary and Krista for the questions. That was a good one, and we could talk, like most of these topics, we could and we have talked endlessly about them. Well, that's all for today. So if you have a question, ask us on Twitter at LGGPod. Email us at lggpodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Facebook. We are on all the social medias, and we'll be happy to engage with you there. We think. I'm sure there's more out there we don't know about. And if you like what you hear, please review us. We really appreciate that. Reviews help with search engine optimization and people finding us and tuning in and letting us do what we do. I think next time we're going to talk about modding and customization. I think the original impetus for this was the Mad Max movies. But Kirk's also a 40K guy, and we'll talk about 3D printing, making your own Cards Against Humanity's cards, 3D printing terrain tiles for Settlers of Catan, and interesting things like that. Some of these things have actually come up and not been litigated, but at least been
and there's been some interesting interesting sort of recent cases, I'd have to say, being the last couple of years in conjunction with this topic, so it's a good one for us to get into. It's also one of those that I think we get asked questions on a lot.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you all again for tuning in, and we look forward to next time.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded at Cool Fire Studios in St. Louis, Missouri.